Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Diversity Month Roundtable. My name is Deidre Mills Hall, and I am the Program Coordinator of Tourism Diversity Matters. Tourism Diversity Matters was founded as the collaborative leader of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and concepts that strive to address the blind spots of ethnic disparities within our industry through lucrative programs, research, resources, and training. Our goal is to advocate for an inclusive environment where everyone is welcome and their voices can be heard. On behalf of Tourism Diversity Matters, we would like to welcome you to our Diversity Month Roundtable. We have come a long way since launch and are thrilled to have you join us today for this awesome event. So without further ado, I now turn you over to our Executive Director, Greg DeShields.
Thank you so much, Deidre, and everyone. Welcome to our first program with Tourism Diversity Matters. We have thoroughly enjoyed the celebration of Diversity Month and have featured some amazing organizations telling the stories in terms of all of their activities embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you have not visited our website, I encourage you to do so, because there you will see a collective gathering of some of the best organizations across the country who are doing amazing things with diversity, equity, and inclusion. As was mentioned, my name is Greg DeShields. I'm the Executive Director of Tourism Diversity Matters, as well as the Philadelphia Convention and Visitors Bureau. Tourism Diversity Matters is an amazing organization that has had an incredible start since the beginning of February, helping to express all of the focus that we can around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and engaging our incredible hospitality community across the country. If you have not already gotten your vaccine, I encourage you to do so, because we in the tourism industry anxiously await your ability to travel and visit this amazing country and enjoy the experience and the excitement that is associated with the world of travel. We have certainly seen an uptick of activity in our hotels, in our restaurants, in our airline industry, all across the country, and we want you to join us. But while you do so, we encourage you to also embrace the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in realizing that for our industry, diversity is what we are and it is what we do. After all, the idea of travel is to experience something different than what we normally do, and those differences is what makes us stronger as individuals. Throughout the course of this month, we have raised the voice of a variety of organizations and told their stories around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're excited today to conclude Diversity Month with an incredible and very provocative roundtable. We are thrilled to be able to engage in a conversation that really talks about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we feel as though we have gathered an incredible table of individuals who will tell you a variety of unique perspectives around the subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're thrilled to have Valerie Gavin, who is Vice President with Accor Hotels, serve as our moderator. Our board chair from Tourism Diversity Matters and president of Destination DC, Elliott Ferguson, will join the panel. Michelle Mason from Association Forum will be amongst the panelists, and our very own Dr. Brandi will serve as a panelist as well, providing us perspectives from a millennial point of view. So I think it's time to get things started. I know that we have a very anxious audience. We encourage you to use the chat, talk to each other, post some questions. We'll be sure to take that information and share it with our moderator as we move into our Q&A. So without any further ado, Valerie, I'll turn it over to you, and to everyone, once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Greg, thank you so much. I am really looking forward to these conversations today with these three really inspiring leaders. First, I would be happy to introduce Elliott Ferguson, as you mentioned, President and CEO of Destination DC and the Chairman for Tourism Diversity Matters. Elliott, before we get started, did you want to just share a couple comments about Destination DC?
Sure, and hello to you and the audience from all over the U.S. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I think as we look at all that Destination DC focuses on, which is of course economic development, we're in the same boat as many of you in terms of trying to navigate beyond the pandemic and find ways in which we can continue to stimulate our economy with visitors coming to the city. So we're 501c6, and we solely focus on economic development through conventions and tourism.
Thank you. I'm curious, today there are many organizations that are really trying to find their way with DE&I best practices. What advice would you share for those organizations that maybe don't have an individual on their team that's actually dedicated to DE&I?
I mean, I will say that very few organizations actually do have a staff person that focuses on DEI. I know that Philadelphia, especially with Greg and others that have been in the role, have done an amazing job in Philadelphia. And I will say that, one, you have to look at your resources. You've got to stay true to the overall goal of the organization and make sure that you're putting heads, beds, butts, and seats. But at the same time, you want to make sure you have checks and balances to make sure that you're meeting the needs of not only those that live within your community, which as a DMO, we traditionally have not seen those that live in Washington as our audience, but they are, as well as ways in which we can attract people from diverse backgrounds. We focus a lot of our efforts on an international market. Some of the biggest mistakes that individuals make, and this is not new, is when they have folks that, I've heard several times, a Procter & Gamble in the 60s would make decisions in terms of advertising and marketing for women-based products without women at the table. And we all know how wrong that is. And I think that it's important to make sure that you're focusing on the needs of the folks that work for you. Look at your staff, see whether or not you represent a true diversity within your team. Ask them questions. I ask my team all the time. And sometimes it's not necessarily what I want to hear in terms of what we should be focusing on as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as a Black person in this space that has had a very loud mouth in the last 18 months, I will say that I've learned a lot about what we should be doing. Now, does that mean I'm going to hire a person? Not necessarily, because what I've done is I've put together a team of folks within my organization that are focusing solely on just this subject, and to make sure that we're focusing on not only the needs of the team, but also looking at our board and looking at how we promote and market DC as a destination. I would encourage anyone and everyone to challenge the leadership, because sometimes when we're having these conversations, it's like in church, everybody's shaking their head and they're all agreeing, but they may not even realize we're talking about them or you're talking about them. And I get those calls from members of your staff saying, it's amazing that this person's on this board or a panelist, whereas they're truly not understanding that they don't get what DEI is all about or what Black Lives Matter was all about over the last few years, and having that dialogue with that team. So it starts with making sure that your team represents these variables, your board of directors, and of course, all of your marketing. But talk to the people that work for you. And I assure you, if you have an environment where they are comfortable in being open and honest, you'll get an earful, and it should influence how you continue to manage and market your organization.
I've seen exactly what you're talking about happen within my own organization. Sometimes you say, oh, we don't have that problem. And then when you start talking about it, you realize, oh, wow, there's so much more when you really start hearing from everyone. So that's great insight. Thank you.
Valerie, I'll say real quickly that the biggest mistake you make is that you don't foster an environment where the employees feel comfortable and also sharing that we're not where we should be. A lot of people are fearful of losing their jobs, or not even those can be and say, well, why are some of you so combative when you're having this conversation? And yet when you present, Elliott, you come across a certain way. I said, well, on the inside, I'm very upset too. I said, I may present in a different way to you, but there is a lot of frustration and anger, more frustration as pertains to what we should be focusing on within our organization as a whole.
And I guess that speaks a lot to maybe the reasons why it has been so difficult for hospitality and tourism to achieve real success in terms of DEI.
No, I agree 100%. I think that, quite frankly, it's not been a priority. I think it's been something that people check off and say that we feel like we're doing all the right things without truly understanding that many of my peers are not equipped to truly understand and focus on this the way they should. Or if they have someone that focuses on DEI, especially in major corporations, that person has no access to the CEO or the leadership. And I think it's extremely important that we understand that these dynamics do exist. And in some cases, the CEOs, and I've said several times, we have to be comfortable in having uncomfortable conversations, because it's not easy for a person or anyone to expose the ways in which they've been marginalized. But when you hear it, then people are uncomfortable. But equally as much, I feel it's extremely important for those CEOs that are white, which is the majority of those that run DMOs, to also express what and how they were raised and the things in which that may have influenced them, their unconscious bias, which they may not have even recognized. Because if we're not comfortable in having uncomfortable conversations, how are we going to do better? I remember a peer called me representing a city that said, basically, my mayor does not want Black people visiting our city. She asked me would I do a panel with the mayor, with their stakeholders, to talk about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I said, yeah, I'll do it, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm going to be very frank and honest about how, as a Black person, I feel when I'm not welcome in a destination. And equally as much, what you're missing in terms of the economic impact of the visitation, as well as how you're alienating a percentage of those that live in your destination. When I entered the industry in the 80s in Savannah, it was a different destination than it is today in terms of welcoming me as a Black person in management, the first person within that organization that was not in the mailroom. And I had to deal with a whole lot of stuff I was trained to deal with. I encourage millennials, Generation Z, don't stand for the things in which I was trained to suck up and move forward out of fear of losing my job. Don't ever work in an environment where you don't feel like your needs aren't being represented. And these are key things that I've learned along the way in terms of me unlearning some of the things in which I learned to be not only manage my organization, but also speak on this particular subject.
Those are really excellent points. And I think and it is difficult. I think sometimes people are afraid to speak up as well. And I think we have to encourage them to make progress by moving forward. And you have to do something. You're the chair for TDM. What do you hope to see TDM achieve next 3 years?
I will say that last year was very polarizing for me, especially watching what the world witnessed and what we saw, the outcome of a guilty verdict with the death of George Floyd. It was similar to me moving here after 9/11, whereas I thought about all the things in which I enjoyed about what I did and all the opportunities that I missed because I felt somewhat marginalized, and I accept. And I think last year was an opportunity for me to take a self-assessment of what I should be doing in a leadership role, especially as chair of U.S. Travel Association, and be more purposeful in leading this discussion and having others to be a part of it. And it wasn't just me, it was amazing people that are in the industry that didn't turn to 21, that wrote letters, that focused on ways in which we can do better. I think that as my 2-year chairmanship sunsetted, I was thinking along the lines of, I don't want this to end. I don't have to be the only voice in the room, but I feel like I need to continue the momentum, or this will suffer the same fate as other attempts, whereas we have these ebbs and flows and all of a sudden we stop talking about it. When Mike Gamble approached me, Mike Gamble has been amazing and very instrumental in this space, and then told me that Greg DeShields was going to be the chair. This was a great opportunity for me to continue the conversation, but under Greg's leadership, focus on specific things in which we want to see happen and make sure that the leaders within the industry understand their role in making these things happen, as well as the fact that I don't know what it's like to be a Black female lesbian. I say that specifically because that's one of the panels that I was on, and I thought about it. Her mentality was that I am a minority and marginalized for those 3 things. And I'm like, wow, that's powerful. And I've never thought about looking at it through that lens. Well, that's the same thing in which I'm saying to most of my white counterparts, is that no one expects you to truly understand the dynamics of Elliott Ferguson and who I am as an individual. But what I want to do, and what TDM will give us the opportunity to do, is to get you to understand how I could have easily have been George Floyd simply because of the color of my skin. And even though many leaders look at it and say, well, no, that couldn't have been you because you're so articulate and you're this, and they see me a certain way. I'm like, yeah, let me walk down your street at night and all you see is a dark figure that you automatically will be concerned about. And I said, that's part of the lesson, the shock value of understanding what it's like to be part of the LGBTQIA community in America, be with a handicap or female, and the list goes on, and make sure that TDM focuses on all those aspects of the people that quite frankly make up the hospitality industry today.
Very well said. I couldn't agree more with everything that you said. Thank you. We'll come back to you. I'm going to introduce Dr. Brandi Baldwin. She's the CEO of Millennial Venture Holdings. Dr. Brandi, do you want to tell us a little bit about Millennial Venture Holdings?
Absolutely. So Millennial Ventures is a company that launches social impact brands. I'm excited because we had an opportunity to really take some of the work I had been doing in the DEI field for the last decade and kind of package it up. And we launched the Calling All Allies project. So I'm here representing Millennial Ventures and that project, and looking forward to the discussion today.
What was it that really drew you to wanting to be involved with TDM?
Sure. So I think when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to look at it really from an industry lens. And while there are many industries that have made great strides, I think that when you're talking about the tourism and hospitality industry, there's some more work to be done. And so from an organizational development perspective and really helping the industry catch up to where some other industries have done amazingly, I wanted to make sure to be there, particularly in that workforce development piece. So seeing more leaders, creating pathways for leadership for Gen Z and also for millennials to be in those specific industries. And so I'm excited to be kind of working on some of those initiatives and also using research. Our partnership with Temple University, my alma mater, is going to help us to reach those goals.
What are your thoughts regarding just the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion today?
Sure. Okay. That's a broad question.
But that's a big one.
Let me tell you. So when I really think about the state of DEI right now, there's a couple things that immediately come to mind. First and foremost, there are so many more people than there were after last year that know about DEI. This is a real industry. We've been around for decades. It's nothing new. And so I love the idea that there's so many people that maybe weren't aware that, wow, my organization doesn't have this as a role, or we haven't really as a part of our organizational goals and our KPIs, we haven't been thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a company standpoint. That has been very surprising to people, but I think folks are caught up, right? So that's one thing that I'm excited about. The thing that's really, I think, troublesome to me that I always like to sound the alarm on is the fact that now let's move past conversation. We've had conversations and let's move into action, purposeful and strategic action. And so when I think about the state of DEI, there's so much that has caused division, and rightly so. There's so many things that we have had to reconcile over the last 12 months in particular, but let's move towards finding common ground. I mean, it reminds me of the civil rights era, where allies came from everywhere, from all walks of life, to really support that particular movement that was focused on Black Americans at that time. And so now when you think of all of the other diversity dimensions, the LGBTQ community, it's very important. Gender equity, we've had those discussions, but what about parents in the workplace? What about the disability community? I think we have to really expand our vision and use the efforts that have really been sparked again through this sort of racial equity movement and make it as inclusive as possible. But we have to be strategic, we have to be purposeful, and quite frankly, we need strategy. That's the sustainability issue. We can talk all day, but you can't workshop your way into equity. You have to really engage with experts like TDM and all of our organizations combined. We have that DEI knowledge. We can't wait for people to get over their biases. We can't wait for individuals to have to learn how it feels to be in everyone else's shoes. What we can do right away is create systems and processes so that even if biased, and we all have biases, right? But even if certain individuals are in certain roles, the system will hold them accountable. And so when you think about recruiting and promotion and things like that, that's what our firm is really looking for. We're saying, how is the system perpetuating bias? How is the system maybe perpetuating inequity? Let's fix it there. There's nothing like a good handbook and policies and procedures that can help to back employees up who feel that they're being mistreated. We have to fall in alignment with what their standards are and use a lot of the HR commissions that are around the entire country. There's a lot on paper and there's a lot of power that we have, but in organizations, I don't want talk, I want action. We can have a roundtable all we want. We can have an unconscious bias training all we want, but are those policies and procedures in place to make sure that everyone across the board has an equitable opportunity for leadership?
I agree with you. I think for so long, companies thought that it was okay just to say, we believe in DEI. You're right. Over the past year, there've been a lot more conversations. The only way to go forward is we act on it. Totally agree. How do you see millennials and Gen Z, how they change this whole conversation?
I'm an older millennial, but let me tell you, millennials been getting a bad rep for years, right? So I'm always advocating for millennials. And before we even jump into the DEI context, they've been sounding the alarm and saying, hey, I've seen my parents work 40, 50, 60 hours a week only to get laid off around 2008, 2009, that first kind of recession. They felt their parents not have the energy or the time when they came home. I was a latchkey kid. When I came home from school, no one was there. Why? My mother was working. So besides the fact that we sort of grew up in a lower socioeconomic status environment, even middle class Americans experienced these working parents that were trying to make it and get to be a part of the American dream. But what the millennials have been saying is that we need change. And think that when you put this in the DEI context, I'm excited about the fact that millennials have ripped the Band-Aid off, bucking the system, But a caution that I'm going to give to millennials that are listening, or those organizations here, is that, again, we have to be strategic. You can have a bullhorn, and that's one thing, but are you ready to play chess? And so we have to really elevate Gen Z and the millennials, and they need to be strategic in the workplace, because quite frankly, last one hired, first one fired, that's real talk, right? And so we don't want to negatively impact their economics because we're not giving them purposeful strategies on how to navigate organizational politics. You can't just go into the CEO's office with a list of demands. We work with clients that have said, our employees gave us like this list of demands of what we need to do, and like it doesn't go over well. And so I think that we need to find a happy medium and find some strategy there. But I'm excited because when you think about DE&I, because of technology, because of media, millennials and Gen Z saw diversity right on their TV screens, right in their phones. And so they want the real world that they live in and the organizations that they work in to be reflective of that. I think that they're not going to lift their foot off the pedal with this one. They're going to be holding organizations accountable. What I've been seeing is the accountability being in, again, talk, and rather than coalescing together, collaborating together, and putting together a strategy that you actually can walk into the executive office with, and that ties what's happening to business outcomes, to even some data. So we have to be strategic at all costs. Gen Z and millennials are expecting equity. They're expecting inclusion. As long as we can find opportunities to help them communicate that message and back it up and be high performing at the same time, then I think this is going to go well. Last thing I'll kind of add to this is, we really are struggling right now in the workforce with this gap, this leadership gap. You have 10,000 baby boomers reaching retirement age daily, over 3 million a year. And there are not enough Gen Xers, sorry, Gen Xers, there are not enough of them to fill those leadership positions. So the industry, the hospitality and tourism industry, is going to really need to start figuring out how to identify high performing millennials who can do it, who have not only the knowledge and education, but really the character to fill those roles that are going to be necessary in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brandi. I am going to introduce our definitely last but not least panelist, Michelle Mason. She's the president and CEO of Association Forum and a fellow board member. Michelle, do you want to first just tell us a little bit about Association Forum?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Valerie and TDM. Association Forum is a membership organization located in Chicago, representing more than 1,600 associations. And our focus as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion is creating welcoming environments, places, and spaces for all to thrive and be successful.
Thank you. So we are 13 months into this whole remote workforce, and it definitely appears that some companies are looking to bring back their teams in person, some as early as this summer. How do you think it's important for leadership to really prioritize DE&I planning in tandem with safely bringing their workforce back?
Great question, Valerie. And I'd first like to say, Dr. Brandi, I'm a Gen X, so don't discount us. Don't discount the boomers either. We still have value. But great remarks from Dr. Brandi. It's always great to be on a panel with her. When I think about leadership's role with diversity, equity, and inclusion, it should always be a priority. Whether you're opening your offices or your communities, it should be an integrated strategy. Dr. Brandi talked about systems and processes. It really centers around people, process, and systems. So that level of integration will be key for success, particularly as we think about how we've, over the past 13 months, we have worked remote. And so being able to make sure voices are heard and appreciated and a part of the process as we are starting to reopen our businesses, our offices, and just reimagine our future of work is going to be critical for leaders to make that a priority. I often say silence tells a story. So it is the leader's role to demonstrate that they are being proactive instead of reactive. So the prioritization will be key for a variety of reasons. One, making that stronger connection with your staff, the stronger connection with your client and your customer. Making it a priority will also elevate the brand of organizations, particularly destinations. And also when we think about loyalty, we think about engagement, and we think about contributions. We also know that organizations that are diverse outperform organizations that are not. So it is a part of your business strategy. It should be integrated. And it also provides an opportunity to elevate multiple voices, to bring that level of creativity and innovation that we all need as we enter into this new normal, if we can say new normal.
Do you think that there are strategies that cities can implement to be more culturally inclusive communities?
Yes, there are strategies that cities can implement. It will be the city's greatest opportunity to focus on cultural inclusivity as a key business strategy. When we think about destination marketing organizations and cities, I mean, this is a community shared asset. So one strategy is just bringing the stakeholders together to have the conversation. How can we be more culturally sensitive? How can we overcome some of these barriers or issues that we are facing? Have a shared vision, have alignment. And in many cases, it might be uncomfortable to have those conversations. But to Elliott's point, you have to be comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations because that's where the greatest change occurs. But definitely just aligning the key stakeholders to be responsive to the emerging opportunities that are before it will be critical to success. In addition to that, when we think about a city implementing a strategy of that nature, making sure diverse voices and assets are at the table, regardless how you define it, it really attracts new investment, diverse investment to the city as well. Representation matters. So from a planning perspective, my members are associations. My members will be holding cities accountable for not just representation and leadership, but show me this in action. Dr. Brandi talked about millennials and Gen Z activating last year. That level of activation will be entering the workplace and they will be the decision makers that she referenced. So it's better to be on the proactive side than the reactive side and make sure that we're focusing on being welcoming and inclusive of all.
Tourism Diversity Matters is a fairly new organization. Do you have thoughts on what would impact look like?
Yeah, I think TDM is a right organization at the right time. Since February, it has accomplished amazing work. I believe the impact that is currently demonstrating is very important to our industry because it's brought together a coalition of diverse leaders to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in the tourism industry. But it's also focused on research. It's also focused on having courageous, critical conversations like the one we are having today. And we need that body that recognizes that some of our parts are far more important than the individual components. And again, it goes back to a systematic, integrated approach because we are really one ecosystem and we should be working together in alignment. And impact and successful tourism, TDM, will be critical in recognizing that and facilitating that for all of us to benefit from.
So much to do. I agree. It is perfectly timed. I continue to be impressed with how much progress that has been made in such a short period of time with TDM. One thing that I think is also timely, I think we're somewhat surprised as a hospitality and tourism industry that right now, as hotels and venues and destinations are starting to open up, we're finding that it's not as easy to bring back our talent. So there's also some opportunity in that, right? Because we do need a reset. So how can we really attract a diverse pool of talent and how can we go about that?
First of all, hello to Brandi and Michelle. Good to see you both and good to be on a panel with you. One of the biggest lessons that most of my counterparts have learned and understand is that you can't fish in the same pond for like some degree of diversity. And that's a reoccurring issue. I've heard from several folks that said, hey, I live in a city, I want more diversity on my team, but I can't attract them. There are certain realities. Well, one, if you come at me and you ask me a question, I'm going to be respectful, but I'm not going to sugarcoat the answer. And I think that's extremely important. So if you're truly interested in cultivating a diverse climate within your workplace, you have to fish in different ponds and you have to look through a different lens and ask key questions. And the most important thing to understand is that as we're looking at arguably 4 generations in the workplace right now, granted, I know we've been talking about millennials and Generation Z, but not necessarily in a derogatory way, but the reality is they're the largest workforce today and arguably will be the largest workforce overall in the next couple of years. I'm a Gen X baby boomer on the cusp. I look at things through a lens, whereas I try to unlearn a lot of the things in which I was taught by my generation. Wait your turn, be more respectful, be more mindful of things. Don't speak what you feel because you may not have a job, which was actually true. And I think that's the thing in which we continue to reference as we look at the younger generations, and especially from a positive perspective. So as we're looking at making sure that individuals have a diverse workplace, they're going to have to really work a little harder to attract people to that destination, because in some cases, there's not a lot of diversity in that community. That means you have to work a little harder harder and you have to do a little bit more to attract those individuals. The key point as we're looking at those younger generations is that they expect that diversity, no matter what color they are. And if you don't believe that, just look at those who were marching last year during the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a very diverse group of individuals that were out there, which has not happened probably since 1963 March on Washington, plus or minus a couple of other times. It's a different generation, it's a different time, and you have to change the way you do business or you're going to continue to fail because you're not going to find people that really represent diverse backgrounds.
That's true. Someone just commented unlearning is the best kind of learning, and that's what needs to happen. So to your point, very true. I saw a question here to you, Dr. Brandi. It was about your points on economic inequity and how do we deal now with inclusion and equity for industry and those that we serve and maybe excluded specifically because of income or housing.
I would take this from really a psychological perspective. When you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you may not be familiar, but it talks about our needs as individuals. And so I think when we're thinking about strategies, especially those economic disparities, one thing I love about Philly is there are so many free events that used to happen in the summer on the waterfront. There are so many things that you could participate in, whether it's Odun Day or other festivals. If you could just walk, take the bus, if you can hitch a ride and get there, you can participate. So I think that's going to be important as cities open up from a tourism and hospitality piece, but that may take some time with the COVID-19 situation. But when you look at a hierarchy of need, this sort of pyramid, on the bottom, it's food, air. The next is like shelter, safety, and then on up. And so I think we have to be mindful of being more purposeful with the organizations, the groups that we're trying to help, and understand that waking up, if you really are in dire straits economically, the last thing on your mind is entertainment. So we have to be mindful of allowing those social service organizations or other entities in the community to support them and just be specific and strategic with who we're trying to support, who is our ideal audience for this, and how are we trying to help. And the reason why I say this is because we tend to see issues in other groups and want to help other groups, but really, is that what they need right now? Is that what's a high priority for them? So I think data is very important before we make any decisions. And I think that a lot of times we can actually do best in our own lanes. And so it's like, oh, how do we change the world? How do we change America? America is so this. Well, guess what? America's made up of companies and corporations and organizations. Do your best in your organization, and collectively we can have a more equitable country and place to live. And so kind of a high level answer, but I think we need to not try to put initiatives or things that we perceive to maybe be a priority for others on those who are ready, willing, and able to participate. Let's focus on that group first, but still keep our ears and collect data for those others to say, hey, I want to participate. And that really means that they're a little bit above that base level of their negative economic impact.
When we have meetings and events in local communities to help in those communities and even for companies you're working from, Michelle, is this something that you discuss with the associations?
Oh, absolutely. Social responsibility should be a part of every org strategy. I mean, how can you have a strong, robust diversity, equity, and inclusion program without a focus on giving back, without a focus on helping the communities that you serve in? And so we absolutely encourage our members, when you're in communities, take the time to get to know the city, the community, and give back. Be an empathetic organization and leave it better than when you encountered it. So that's certainly a business strategy that will also help to elevate the mission of the organization. And when we think about fundamentally what an association represents and the good that it provides to society, it should be core to strategies that we deploy.
What about so many that are at different stages, right? We've got some people that are really just trying to get started. So if you have someone that is maybe in a smaller organization and they really just want to understand how they can best impact with small resources, are there little things that you can start with taking that first step?
I think it starts with having a conversation within your organization. That is the first step. When we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, Association Forum is not a large organization, but we view ourselves, we're an impactful organization. And we leverage our platform, we leverage our network to encourage our members to have the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know that silence tells a story. We know that it starts with leadership. And we know that each organization has a separate DNA. But as I mentioned earlier, the sum of our parts, the whole, is far better than individual components. And that's how we want to measure impact. So having a conversation, empowering your team members, your employees to contribute to the process. I believe Dr. Brandi mentioned that earlier, as well as Elliott. That's really great empowerment within your organization. And also from an association perspective, engage your members in the process.
And also recognize the fact that sometimes you have to go to the community leaders that represent those groups that you are trying to attract and gain insight from them. The things I've learned in terms of DEI requires me to go to others that have done a better job. Or because I live in Washington, there's an association for everything. So if I have not been more purposeful for looking for individuals with disabilities to come and work for Destination DC, I'm going to go to that organization that represents disabled veterans and or others that have disabilities, because they are going to have that insight. Again, it's looking through a different lens in terms of how you want to accomplish your end goal.
Another thing I can add to this really, and I think this is really what Michelle and Elliott are both saying, is really the data. You know, when you're having conversations and you're reaching out, that's qualitative. You can also have quantitative data. Assessments are important. I've been seeing so many organizations in the last year in particular that are sort of putting the cart before the horse. They're coming up with these awesome ideas on paper. They're whiteboarding these ideas, on the board, and, oh, we should do that. And it's really copycat DEI because their competitors are doing that, or because, if I had $1 every time someone reached out to the Calling All Allies project and said, oh, we want that. Give us unconscious bias. Give us this. And I say, well, what is your organizational issue? And what is your problem? Well, we don't know that yet, but give us this solution. And so what we want to do is keep our ears to the streets, so to speak, but give people an opportunity in our organizations to lend their voice. Because what a lot of organizational leaders get a bad rep for, unfortunately, is that they do things and it doesn't hit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't seem like it genuinely is fitting the need, solving the needs that are there. So a needs assessment is going to be first step for any organization. Before you get too far, I have companies that have full-blown DEI committees and they haven't done any data collection. I'm thinking, what is helping to inform what you're doing in the DEI committee? Oh, we had some great ideas. This is the issue when we think, oh, we've been struggling with this for 400 years, or we've been struggling with this for decades. And I can't believe, I know why this happens, because we're essentially having solutions that don't actually fit the problem. You don't go to your doctor and tell your doctor what your treatment plan is. You go to your doctor, you tell them your symptoms, and they're going to collect data. They're going to do the blood work. They're going to run some panels on you, and they're going to say, okay, this is what you need. And so in the same way, we want to do that. And too many companies, especially in the hospitality industry and others, they're not relying on experts. That's what TDM is for. They offer assessments. They're able to do that. And so you can't be a patient doing surgery on yourself. You have to have an external person to help you. That's, I think, the first step. Find someone who can fill those gaps for sure.
All really excellent points. And how will TDM help the industry organizations and DMOs to be more educated? And that actually is one of the main goals, is to be that resource. So you're right, you have to do the assessment of your own organization, but TDM can be a resource to help put you in the right direction, and also to share a lot of insight and data as well. If someone from a personal perspective wanted to develop their own leadership style and make sure that they really are becoming more inclusive and advocating for others, what kind of advice would you give that leader that's wanting to improve in this area?
I would say that the last 13 or 14 months have taught us that the way we did it on Monday is not necessarily the way we do it on Friday. Even as Dr. Brandi referenced data, and I'm on Zooms specifically talking about the recovery of our industry, I'm like, well, whatever I said to you on Monday, by Friday, I might be saying something different. And I think leaders need to learn and to understand that if you really want to be a good leader, there has to be a degree of humility. You have to allow your team to respectfully point out the things in which you think you're hitting the mark on, but you're just not, so that you can correct those things. We don't always like what we hear. Again, it's the uncomfortableness in the room, but also you just cannot continue to do business as usual, inclusive of how you manage your team, and expect that team to be happy or to be perceived as a forward-thinking organization or a forward-thinking leader.
Thank you, Elliott. And Michelle, anything that you'd like to add?
Sure, I totally agree with Elliott. And I would say that as a leader, you don't have to feel like you need to have all the answers, because we really don't. And we have to be comfortable with that. And we have to be comfortable, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion, being vulnerable, being able to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to find out the answer. And if you are a white male, in many cases, you've not walked in our shoes, but you can walk beside us and be comfortable with that. And I would also say just demonstrating a very authentic, genuine sense of empathy. And let's not let this be a moment because of the past 13, 14 months, we need to continue this movement. This is not something that is new, it's ongoing. It's just more visible now, and there's more engagement now. This is something that we need to continue to not only have these conversations, but also demonstrate action within our organizations, because that also tells a story as well.
Can't wait until you have all the right, perfect answers.
It's not going to ever be perfect.
Yeah, the last thing I'll kind of add to that is really going back to a comment I made earlier about the dimensions of diversity. I think leaders really need to educate themselves on really what diversity means and how inclusive it really is. We have to honor the D, the E, and the I. And so when you think about things like religion, religious affiliation, education level, socioeconomic status, race, gender, age, like all of those things, but even some of those micro level dimensions like parent or non-parent, or even a caretaker. There are some people that are taking care of their parents or other family members, and that impacts their professional life and their needs there. And so I think that's one of the first steps that leaders can do is you don't have to learn about every other culture. You have to be open, receptive, and just listening and just know the dimensions. And when you understand those different dimensions of diversity, then when they present themselves, you'll see them that way. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I think what's unfortunately happening in the DI industry with strategies is that people are really taking a superficial approach. And so although Michelle may be an African-American and present as African-American, there are other dimensions of her identity and who she is. Same thing with Elliott and all of us. And so we don't want to discount one for the other, but serve the whole employee. And last thing I'll say is less doing, more being. Stop trying to do DEI. Stop trying to do equity work and be equitable. Show up that way. We overcomplicate things. At the end of the day, we all know what it looks like when someone's being disrespected, or we know what it looks like when someone's being condescending to another. We don't need to go through a 10-step program to figure out, oh, wow, how do I step up as an ally? In that staff meeting, when you see or hear that someone is speaking in a derogatory manner towards your colleague, simply step up in that moment. And so we overcomplicate things and make it such a big issue. And DEI is really a business imperative. We don't get nervous when we go to leadership development sessions. We don't get nervous if you're doing a workshop on conflict management or communications. So why is it the same way with the DEI? And so as we shift the narrative a little bit and create more spaces for common ground, I think people will realize that it's just normal. DEI shouldn't be a special category. We're doing DEI. We're being equitable people, and organizations are filled with individuals. Each individual needs to focus on themselves and how they show up and have that personal responsibility. And then the organization will get better.
That will be the goal when we don't need to have these conversations. So I think that's a perfect way to wrap that up. There are some questions for you, Greg, around the types of resources that TDM plans to provide.
TDM plans to make a number of resources available, starting from having a fair and basic understanding of DEI. We can assist a variety of organizations with just understanding the fundamentals of DEI. We certainly feel that as it relates to your understanding, dive into the deep end of the pool, really learn the understanding of what DEI can bring to your organization. There are a lot of fundamentals as well as some basic aspects of DEI that are really crucial to know in terms of your organization. How do you define diversity and inclusion? It was referenced earlier about the dimensions of diversity. How clear are you in terms of that? And then you really have to take a very hard look at your organization itself, really analyze the culture. I'm often quoted when I say that a lot of organizations are diverse because they didn't necessarily intend to be diverse. And now we have to take this gasoline engine and turn it into a hybrid engine. And we have to look internally. We have to evaluate our culture as an organization. We have to determine, are we in fact functioning as an organization that can really implement successful and productive outcomes as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So at some point in time, before you really get into the weeds of this, you have to do an organizational assessment, and that may have been mentioned earlier. And that is certainly something that TDM can assist you with. An organizational assessment will look at your governance, will look at your leadership, will look at your outreach, will look at your programs, and we'll certainly look at what you do in terms of supplier diversity. Those fundamentally should give you a good foundation to build on a DEI strategy and determine what is truly within your capability of achieving success. But I will remind everyone, DEI is not something that you fix. So if you are approaching this to suggest that even without providing the resources that are necessary, that it can make a difference within your organization, you'll probably be on the short end of this and not achieve any success. I would encourage you to envision this as the journey it is. and that it is a part of your business imperative. And to that degree, it should be resourced accordingly in order to deliver the outcomes that you expect. Like if you put $2 into a coffee break for a DEI meeting, I'm sure you're going to expect to see some return on that. And you should think broadly about that in terms of whatever your undertaking would be with respect to that. And I cannot emphasize enough about the metrics and the measurements, because DEI really needs, like any business activity, the ability to know what's the baseline and what is the gap and what do we intend to see as growth or outcomes and success of our organization. So within whatever kind of assessment you do, there should be some analytical data that gives you some strong, solid business decisions, as you would in any aspect of your business, and especially when you think of it strategically, to know what is feasible within the specific time that we have outlined and what are the goals that we expect to achieve. There are a number of tactics that will get you there, but have a clear sense of where you're going as an organization.
Thanks, Greg. There's one more question about those that maybe aren't in a leadership role. Maybe they're in an administrative or support role. And what can they do to use their voices and speak up?
DEI is the responsibility of everybody. Certainly it leads from the top, but we all own a piece of that. I think as an individual, you should really do an internal assessment of yourself and find out what are your cultural competencies and what is your ability of your own perspective to have a sense of what DE&I is. Seek out those leaders in your organization that perhaps you can step up and be a part of the overall organization's efforts. Some organizations will establish an employee resource group or a business resource group, and that's a great way to, as an individual, become participative. You can build some leadership skills and maybe become co-chair or chair of that particular committee. But it is everyone's responsibility, and you should not feel as though you're in an island when it comes to this. Having a good sense of where you are as an individual will allow you to have a much more focused approach in terms of how you can contribute. And just bear in mind, there are so many ways now to become educated. If you are interested and you have a desire to really focus on DEI, there are a number of free webinar programs that you can attend in order to gain greater insight. And you can certainly take the time to maybe consider looking at certification in order to build more credibility and insight and knowledge in your own rights about it.
And one of the things we talk about within the meetings we have as we're developing Tourism Diversity Matters is to get leadership to understand that everybody's voice is important, from the entry-level person to the intern or whoever's working for you. It's important that they all feel as if they can speak up and share their perspective. That takes me back to, again, my generation, whereas that was unheard of, and I think that that's the thing we have to unlearn. And unfortunately, there are probably more leaders that are in my generation and or other older generations than they are millennials and Generation Z. So it's extremely important that as we look at Tourism Diversity Matters, in addition to telling them the things in which they should focus on in their leadership, things in which they should focus on in the development of themselves. And one of it is the opportunity to make sure that everyone has a voice, everyone is heard. Not everything that everyone says is going to be done, but we should be purposeful and at least being objective and open-minded to the needs of the folks that work for us versus being dismissive.
A perfect note to end on. We all have a voice and we all can make an impact. Thank you all so much for your time. And I'll turn it back over to Greg.
On behalf of Tourism Diversity Matters, I would like to extend a sincere thank you and appreciation to Valerie, Michelle, Dr. Brandi, and Elliott. This was our first opportunity to engage in a very provocative discussion around the subject matter of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we certainly have more to say. I would be remiss if I also did not acknowledge my team over at Tourism Diversity Matters, Deidre Mills Hall, who is the most incredible support person to ensure that we can deliver quality programming like this. And of course, our founder, Mike Gamble, who has, without any doubt, really indicated to the industry of how leadership can step up and make a difference. So on behalf of Tourism Diversity Matter, thank each and every one of you for joining us today. And we look forward to you visiting our website, learning more about our programming. I bid you all a great Friday. Take care.